Hi friends, thank you for joining us for this special broadcast, whether you're seeing us on Facebook or someplace else. So glad that you've joined us and hope that this will be worth your time. My name is Joseph Backholm and I am the Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview and Strategic Engagement here at the Family Research Council. And today, here in an election season, in my capacity as Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview, we're going to talk about how to think biblically about the way we evaluate candidates. And we all know that this is a hot issue within the church and even in some cases outside the church in the 2020 election, as it was in the 2016 election. And the title of today's talk, intended to be provocative, is Why Christians Can't Vote for Joe Biden. Now, of course, we're going to take a position on Joe Biden and several policy issues, but really, more than we intend to talk about Joe Biden, I hope to provide a framework to you that will allow you to evaluate every candidate on your ballot, not only here in 2020, but into the future as well. So let's get started. I want to lay some foundation for this conversation. One of the first things I want to remind us of the fact that Jesus is not a Republican or a Democrat. And this is important because obviously Jesus existed long before political parties were a thing, and Jesus will exist long after political parties have faded into history, however long that takes. Secondly, and significantly, Jesus is not a liberal, nor is Jesus a conservative. These are not biblical terms. Now, they're not wrong terms, but these aren't terms that come from Scripture. They're terms that come from culture. And historically, depending on the time and place in which Christians have lived, they have been liberals, like they were in the first century, in the sense that they were challenging social conventions, they were challenging what was normal in their defense of human rights, in their view of the human person, in their opposition to adultery to abortion, and infanticide in the early church. It was one of the hallmarks of early Christians was their reform of certain social practices that did not respect the rights of every person. So in that sense, they would be liberals, as we understand that term, because they're calling for change. More recently, we know Christians are often labeled as conservatives because we seek to conserve biblical standards about gender, sexuality, and marriage. And the point is that we should not be pursuing labels based on political philosophies or political tribes. Our goal is always to be biblical. And the reason for that is because Jesus, though he is not a Republican or a Democrat, conservative or liberal, Jesus is king, and Jesus is right. And I am convinced that once we get to heaven, there is not going to be political diversity. Because we live in a world with imperfect knowledge and imperfect understanding, we have differences of opinions, and people of goodwill can reach different conclusions by observing the same facts, not because they have bad intentions or a lack of intelligence, but simply because we see the world differently. Once we get to heaven, all that will be done away with. We will see and understand perfectly, and we will all understand the correct way to apply truth to a particular set of facts. But the fact that Jesus transcends politics and policy, it does not mean that Jesus is indifferent. And this is an error that I think is often made when people recognize that Jesus is bigger than all of this. He is, but we are under that. Romans chapter 12 calls us to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Or actually, Romans 12, tells us to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The other verse was 2 Corinthians 10. But the reason we do that, the reason we are transformed by the renewing of our mind is because God cares about every single thought that we think and every single thing that we do. And that includes what happens in government. God cares about ideas. Government is where ideas are implemented. Therefore, God cares. Therefore, Jesus is not indifferent. So we can't be indifferent as well. We can't be indifferent either. And one of the ways that we implement those ideas is our involvement in policy, and voting is one of the ways that we do that. And it's important to recognize as we frame this conversation that voting is not a biblical mandate. There's no verse in Scripture that says, "Thou shalt vote, and this is how thou shalt vote." And because when Jesus walked the earth, people didn't have the opportunity to vote. If you happen to be part of the Roman government, you might have some kind of say in how things go. But generally speaking, the early church, and most of the church since the first century, has not had the blessing of living in a place where voting was an option. So we can't say this is how you have to vote in every case and you must fill out a selection or a preference in every single race that's on your ballot. I don't think there's any biblical defense for that position. However, we do know that scripturally, stewardship is a biblical mandate. And this is true in all sorts of ways. This is true of your time. This is true of your money. This is true of your family. This is true of your talents. And we know that parable well, that stewardship is a biblical mandate. And one of the things that God has given us that we as believers have the duty to steward is our citizenship. And we have the obligation and also the fortune of seeking the welfare of the city to which God has sent us. And that's what Jeremiah told the exiles in Babylon. He said in Jeremiah 29:7, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." If it's true for God's exiles in Babylon, it is also true of God's exiles in a Babylonian world like we are. So, setting the stage there. But, in voting is one of the ways that we show stewardship of the city that we're of the place, the city, the town, the country, the community that we live in. But the challenge, and what we're going to really dive into here, is the fact that voting is really a balancing act. Voting is rarely presenting perfect choices to us. And frankly, life very rarely presents perfect choices. And we have to weigh various trade-offs in the decisions that we make. And what we want to think about is how do we weigh the trade-offs, how do we balance the factors in a way that is consistent with what God would have us do as His ambassadors here on earth. And in order to make this evaluation, there's generally two categories that we have, things that we consider. We consider the character of the candidate and also the policies of the candidate, the degree to which the candidate will pursue the common good. Now, some of these choices can be really easy. If we find a candidate that has what we think is really impeccable character and also has a great understanding of the common good and has a path to get there, that's an easy yes. At the same time, there are some candidates that we might see who have lousy character and no understanding of what it means to reach the common good. That's an easy no. Sometimes those options present themselves to us, but oftentimes we are forced to balance somebody who has imperfect character, because everyone has imperfect character, and some people, as we understand it, who might not have a perfect plan for how to achieve the common good. Now, a bit about the common good. As believers, we don't get to define that for ourselves. The common good, what leads to human flourishing, is something that God has revealed to us. So it's our job not to frame our own understanding of what the common good is, but to submit our will to God's, ask what is it that you think about the common good, and to what degree can I use the influence that you have given me, help that happen. That's how we ought to think about what the common good is and how we will get there. But the reality is, in all of these choices, we are dealing with imperfect choices because everyone is imperfect. And every idea, frankly, is imperfect as well. We know this about ourselves, we know this about the candidates on the ballots, and in some cases it's broadcast more prominently than others. But this is the truth. So, how do we look at imperfect candidates, imperfect policy proposals, and make a decision? Here's a framework that we can use to balance these, or not balance these imperfections, we'll say. And there's two ways of looking at this. One, and we're going to compare moral equivalency framework to a proportionality framework. Now, let's start with moral equivalency. And this is the idea that basically all mistakes are kind of equal. That if you have candidate A, who you think is wrong in 3 ways, and candidate B, who is wrong in 3 ways, and candidate A has 2 or 3 weaknesses in their character, and candidate B has also 2 or 3 weaknesses in their character, that you basically keep score of things that you see as weaknesses. They're all basically the same, and so if they basically balance out, then you just pick whichever problems annoy you the least, and that's the candidate that you choose. This is the moral equivalency framework, and in the moral equivalency framework, what you would find is that a candidate who accepts a bribe is not functionally any more flawed than a candidate who has been guilty of speeding ticket, of breaking the law and driving too quickly. Now, not many people hold this position because I think most people would say that bribery, when it comes to public service, is a much greater offense than violating the speed laws. However, it's important to be aware of the moral equivalency framework and argument because a lot of people do refer to the moral equivalency argument as a way of minimizing issues that they know to be great moral wrongs. And we see this happening today when it comes to the issue of abortion. They know that it's a grave evil, but I'm not going to prioritize that in my voting decisions because other things bother me more, and basically the fact that, well, one candidate is wrong in one way and another candidate is wrong in a different way, I'm just going to basically weigh them the same, and this mistake happens to bother me more, and so I'm going to pretend that it's equally as valuable. This is essentially the moral equivalency framework. The second way of looking at this is proportionality. And proportionality is the idea that we understand some mistakes are more serious than others, some errors are more serious than others, some character flaws are even more serious than others, because we all have some, but there are people of higher character than others. Now the proportionality framework, the idea that we're going to balance these interests, I believe is consistent with Scripture. Because when we review Scripture, we see that not all sin is the same. Now, in one sense, all sin is the same. It is the same in the sense that all sin separates us from God. And that even if you have broken even one of these commandments, you have broken them all. And we see that in Scripture. So there is no sin that makes us in greater need of spiritual redemption and forgiveness. However, the graveness of sin, there are degrees, and I think we see this in several places throughout Scripture. And Jesus talked about this in John chapter 19 when he was at his trial before Pilate. Jesus talked about the fact that the people who delivered Jesus to Pilate were guilty of a greater sin, because the people who delivered Jesus to Pilate were aware of the fact that Jesus was innocent, yet for political reasons they passed on Jesus to Pilate for his trial, even though they knew that he was ultimately innocent. Jesus referred to this as a greater sin. We're all very familiar with the log and the speck analogy in Matthew chapter 7. Jesus distinguished between the speck in one's eye and the plank in one's eye, and he admonished us not to overlook the plank, the greater sin in our own lives, in favor of criticizing the lesser sin in someone else's life. Jesus also, in Matthew chapter 23, he rebuked the Pharisees because they would strain out a gnat and yet swallow a camel. And what he was talking about there was the instinct that they had as religious people to be very observant and very detailed about small matters of the law, but then be permissive and ignorant of the larger areas in which, in bigger violations of the law, where they were not keeping God's law. So straining out gnats and swallowing camels. And again, the understanding that some things actually are more important than others. And we see in the book of Ezekiel, when God revealed the sins of Israel in 3 stages, and in each stage, he said that Israel's sins were more detestable than the previous list of sins. So in each of these cases, we see this idea that some things are worse than others. And we kind of believe this instinctively, is that there are, saying a bad word is not necessarily as bad as abusing a child, right? Morally, we kind of intuitively understand that. They're both violations of God's law. They all require forgiveness, but they are not necessarily of the same gravity. Now, this begs the question, if this is true, if not all sins are the same, should Christians be single-issue voters? And this is part of the conversation that we're having. And there are, on all sides of the current political debate, people are criticizing others for their choice of what the most important issue is. Should Christians be moral single-issue voters? Now, we typically, right now, are talking about this in the context of abortion because, of course, the debate within the church largely is, well, President Trump is pro-life, Joe Biden is pro-abortion, And therefore, that settles the debate for me. And there are many people for whom that is the end of the discussion. And other people say, well, there's more to the story than that. We can't just settle it with that one single issue. Now, let's take it out of the context of abortion for a moment, and let's talk about the issue of slavery. Every single person that I have spoken to about whether abortion should be a single issue, single voting issue, would say that they would not support a candidate who supported slavery, regardless of how much commonality they had on other issues. So for virtually everyone, and I so far have not found any exceptions to this, and I doubt you will either, you will have a very difficult time finding people that would say, well, I would vote for somebody who supports slavery as long as they agree with me on all of these other things. People don't take that position because they understand the moral gravity of that issue. However, there are a lot of people, and it seems to me a growing number of people, who would say, well, I think that abortion is a grave moral wrong. However, because the pro-life position is supported by President Trump in this case, and there are a number of things that I don't like about him, and I wish that he was not the president, I'm going to minimize that issue in my final analysis, and ultimately perhaps be willing to vote for somebody who does not share my worldview and who is pro-abortion because of all these other considerations. So how should we think about the possibility of being a single-issue voter? And I think one way to think about this correctly is that being a single-issue voter does not mean that issue is the only thing that matters. And that's often how we think about this scenario, that abortion is the only thing that matters. Instead of seeing it as the only thing that matters, I think the appropriate way of seeing it as a minimum requirement for eligibility. And so in this sense, we would believe, most of us, that opposition to slavery is a minimum requirement for office. Now, it's not the only thing. There are 6-year-olds who have an opposition to slavery, but that's not the only thing that qualifies them for elected office. In the same way, being pro-life and recognizing the value of life is a minimum requirement for elected office. Is that the only thing that makes them eligible? No, but not meeting that very low standard of understanding basic morality should disqualify you from eligibility for the vote of the church. And here's one reason why, is that some issues on a moral level indicate a broken compass. Now, for those of you who have ever navigated with a compass, and everybody's doing it with a phone now, but once upon a time, there were things called compasses, and they would tell you which direction is north. And by virtue of knowing which direction north is, you can figure out any other direction, and it will help you navigate from one place to another. If you have a broken compass that cannot tell you what direction north is, you cannot learn. It will not tell you what direction anything else is either. This happens morally as well, that if you cannot solve this simple moral problems, your moral calculation system may be broken. Therefore, we as believers should understand that defect, and we should not expect somebody with a broken moral calibration system to be able to find the correct answer in other situations as well. In addition, scripturally speaking, evaluating this scenario, it's important for us to understand that some people are enemies of God. Now, of course, this will offend many modern sensibilities, and this does not mean that people are our personal enemies, and we'll get to that in a moment. But some people, biblically speaking, are enemies of God, and there's lots of support for this. Now, we're going to start in John chapter 8, where Jesus was again talking to the religious people of his day who were defending their religious heritage and the fact that they were descendants of Abraham. And Jesus said to them, "You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Because I speak the truth, you do not believe me." Harsh words, no doubt, words that a lot of pastors today would have a hard time saying to the rebellious within their flock, but this is how Jesus referred to the religious leaders of his day. You are of your father, the devil. In Acts chapter 13, in a conversation with a magician, who was trying to lead members of the council away from the gospel. Peter said, "You are full of all deceit and fraud. You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, you will not cease to make crooked straight the ways of the Lord." And actually this was Saul. I think I just said Peter. But another idea that this person who's leading people away from the gospel is actually an enemy of righteousness, a son of the devil. Philippians 3:18. This is Paul writing to the Philippian church. "For many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ." So again, we see this idea that when we are walking in our sin, we are enemies of the cross of Christ. Now, why does this matter to us? Because we as Christians have to have the understanding that people that we like, the people we work with, the people that we go to school with, people even in our own families, in the context of the spiritual war in which we live, there are people who are enemies of the cross of Christ. Now, of course, as I said a moment ago, enemies of God may not be personal enemies, and we find a lot of scriptural support for this as well. And I'll take you to Romans chapter 11 very quickly for this. And this is Paul's conversation about Jews who had rejected the gospel in his day. And it says, "From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the Father." So we have these people that Jesus died for, that he loves, that the gospel is available to, who, spiritually speaking, are enemies of the gospel, but are friends in an earthly sense, and people that the gospel is still available to, who have every opportunity to be reconciled to Christ. And so we have to walk this line between recognizing where people are in terms of the spiritual war, and then also where they are in terms of the mission field that we live and walk in. Of course, this begs the question, how do you know if someone is an enemy of God? And for here, we're going to go very quickly. This is a long study, but we're going to provide a brief answer from James chapter 4. "You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." Now, I want to talk about how we understand if somebody is a friend of the world, who would be an enemy of God, or a friend of God, who would then be an enemy of the world, understanding the spiritual war that this is being waged in. And there are, and I'm going to show you a diagram here, a Venn diagram. What we know is that the culture and the gospel do not conflict in every way, and especially true in the Western world, because we have a Judeo-Christian heritage. And the idea of human rights and the equal dignity of every person is a Judeo-Christian concept that did not exist in the first century. The Roman culture that the church was birthed in did not have a sense of every single person being made in the image of God. And that Christian, Judeo-Christian idea has succeeded in permeating the culture and still exists today. But still, with respect to these ideas, we have things that God believes, and then we have things that the world agrees on. And sometimes they overlap. But what we can attribute that to is the idea of common grace. There are some truths that are known to people even though they have not yet surrendered their life to the gospel, because they understand intuitively, through their lived experience, that these things are true. And there are many issues, which is why there is no conflict between the gospel and the culture on human rights, the dignity of the person. We all agree that we should take care of the poor. We all agree that the marginalized should be cared for. We agree about environmental stewardship. On all of these issues, there might be details on the margins that we discuss and debate about what's the best approach, what's the best solution to the problem. But in principle, we agree on those things. And that's in part because of common grace and the influence that the gospel has had in the Western world, particularly over millennia. But the test of whether somebody is a friend of the world or a friend of God is not determined by the ways in which the world and the gospel agree. It's determined on the issues on which the world and the gospel disagree, which is why we have to pay particular attention to those issues to find out whether somebody is on God's side or whether somebody is on the culture side. And what the temptation is in these evaluations is that we look at 2 or 3 issues where a secular culture agrees with the gospel and says, see, they're not all bad. When in reality, on the issues in which there's disagreement, they have a 100% voting record with the world and a 100% voting record against God. This is important as we make the final assessment of where are these people in this spiritual war that we're ultimately living in. And I'm going to take you to highlight this point to Matthew 23. Again, Jesus is having this conversation with the religious rulers of his day. And he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." So here Jesus is recognizing that every issue is important. But we don't neglect the more difficult, more consequential issues in favor of the easier, less consequential issues. Because in this case, in this culture, in this time, tithing mint, dill, and cumin by the Pharisees, that was something that would earn them the esteem of men. This was something that was well respected, which is why they did it publicly, for everyone to see so they could prove to the culture around them how wonderful they were. But while they were making this show that was obedient to God's law, but really done primarily for men, they were neglecting what Jesus referred to as the weightier provisions of the law that God cared about even more, that might have not earned them the esteem of men. And we have modern parallels to this as well. So I want to talk about what the weightier matters of the law are. And I think for a community, for believers, for a church, trying to find what the common good is, we see the weightier matters of the law from God's perspective in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Because Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are the only places where a perfect world existed. And God established the order, and he told us, and he laid out his plan for what would lead to human flourishing, and for a moment, before sin entered the world, did provide human flourishing. What were the components of this perfect world that God had created? First, he tells us that God made man in his image. The significance of this is, one, that he made us in his image, which gives us our identity. And that also gives us our value. And this is the foundation from which the church and the gospel gives us a pro-life ethic. It's the reason we believe life is worth protecting from conception to natural death, because we are image bearers of God and have infinite value. We are irrepeatable individuals at the moment of conception because we are made in God's image. And that identity is the source of the value. But he didn't just make us individuals in his image. He made us very specifically male and female. Now, for a long time, this was a flyover verse that people wouldn't have spent any time thinking about the significance of it. It's intuitive. God made us male and female. But what we now know is that there is a great deal of controversy around the idea of whether God makes us male and female, or whether we choose to be male and female based on our own preferences. But in God's economy, in God's perfect world, God creates us male and female, and he puts us together in, and we see at the end of Genesis chapter 2, marriage. God creates marriage as a relationship between a man and a woman. For this reason, he says at the end of Genesis chapter 2, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So what we see here is the idea that as individuals, men and women reflect God's identity and part of God's character, God's image. But also, when they come together as husband and wife, they also reflect something about God and his intention and who he is, his image on earth. Now, he brought them together because there were a couple of commands that he gave to man at the very beginning. He said, first, be fruitful and multiply. Have lots of babies. Tells us in the other parts of Scripture that children are a blessing from the Lord. That's why he gives us children, because we were created in his image to be creators. And when we create, when we procreate, we follow the intended design that God made for us as creators, because he also is a creator. And the reason why we need to fill the earth, why we need to be fruitful and multiply, is because he also told us to rule and subdue the earth. We have all these ingredients on the planet. We have natural resources that we have ruled and subdued, that we have applied our intelligence to, our creative capacities to, and we have taken a world that was already wonderful and amazing and at one point perfect, and we have actually improved it because God put us here so that we can do that. That was the mandate he gave us. So understanding this is the component in a perfect world, in a world without sin, from a Christian perspective, and this is what we need to, the big E on the eye chart we need to keep our eyes on, is the fact that he created us in his image, he created us male and female, he created marriage to be the relationship, the foundation of that community, which would then allow us to be fruitful and multiply so that we collectively could rule and subdue the world that God gave us. That is God's design. That's the foundation of a perfect world. And so when it comes to our public policy, how do we pursue the common good? These are, I believe, biblically speaking, the weightier matters of the law. So now, we want to do a quick evaluation of Joe Biden on the weightier matters of the law. And of course, you can do this with any candidate that you want to see how do they align with what God said was good in Genesis chapter 1. Now, a quick review of Joe Biden's positions. First, he wants to codify Roe versus Wade. And most of you will know that Roe versus Wade is the Supreme Court decision that said abortion is a fundamental right. It said the opposite of the idea that every person is made in God's image and worth protecting. It said that some people, depending on their age, can be gotten rid of if we find that they're convenient, and the mother has a constitutional right to get rid of her offspring if she finds that offspring to be an interference with other plans that she has. Now, particularly challenging about Joe Biden is that he claims to be Catholic, and he has a conflict with what he knows God says. And he said in September of 2015, "I'm prepared to accept that at the moment of conception there's a human life and being, but I'm not prepared to say that to other God-fearing and non-God-fearing people that have a different view." So essentially he's saying, I know it's true, but it doesn't matter because I don't want to be accused of opposing my values on someone else. So at the very beginning, he's at war with the idea that we are all made in God's image, and because of that, we all need to be protected. He would say that some people are made in God's image, but because they're too little and they're too inconvenient, we need to get rid of them. This is not the only way. We see it's the life. We also see that he disagrees with the proposition that God made us male and female. Very recently, in a town hall that Joe Biden was involved with, he said that if an 8-year-old wants to change their gender, there should be zero discrimination for this to happen. Of course, during the Obama administration, Joe Biden was there when they wrote a letter to every school district in the country saying that if you do not allow boys to access girls' facilities or girls to access boys' facilities, that you would run the risk of losing your federal education dollars because that's discriminatory. And of course, the discrimination that they're bothered by is anybody who believes male and female are fixed biological realities, and that we should recognize and honor those distinctions in the way we order and live our lives. And so this also is in direct conflict with God's declaration that we are made by God as male and female, because Joe Biden and many others now would say we get to choose if we are male and female based on how we're feeling, and it's possible that we might be neither, or we could be both, depending on the day. Definitely inconsistent with what God told us in Genesis chapter 1. And therefore, it makes sense that because he rejects gender at the structure of who we are as individuals, that he supports the redefinition of marriage as well. Because the whole idea of biblical marriage is the idea that God makes us distinct as individuals, as male or female, and we come together, two shall become one flesh. None of that biblical logic makes sense if you reject the idea that God made us male and female, and that's meaningful and it is fixed. Another application of this there is, so if we're rejecting male and femaleness, we're rejecting marriage as God understands it. Therefore, we're rejecting the multiplication mandate. Now, Joe Biden personally has said less about this, but his surrogates and the people he depends upon for election have been running these campaigns like, save the earth, don't give birth, where Genesis chapter 1 tells us that people, that man is the crown of God's creation, the only thing made in his image, the modern secular worldview is telling us that, well, we're actually the great threat to the planet. We see in other ways where they say, child-free for the planet. And it's this idea that we don't come from God, we come from the earth. The earth is our mother, which is why we refer to it as Mother Earth. And the priority is not humans living as God intended us to. The priority is taking care of our planet, because that's the only hope that we have. And in that worldview often, they assume that the planet has to be eternal, otherwise we have no home, and there's no hope for something that might exist beyond that. But it's not just this personal rejection of the idea that children are always a blessing from the Lord and that we should be fruitful and multiply, and this embrace of the idea that people are actually a threat to the planet, and therefore people have to subjugate their own what's good for people for what's good for the planet. But not only is he personally embraced that, he wants to force that position on everyone else, ironically, despite his position and his statements about abortion, because he would force taxpayers to pay for abortion. And this is one of Joe Biden's great reversals, is on the Hyde Amendment. For a long time, the thing that made him a moderate in many people's minds was the idea that he didn't think taxpayer dollars should be used for abortion. Once he realized that position was going to make it harder for him to get into the White House, get the nomination for the Democratic Party, he was happy to surrender that position, as he has now done, and he's now said he will be eager to compel taxpayers to pay for abortion. But it's not just taxpayers and tax dollars that he wants to use. He also wants to reinstitute abortion insurance mandates. Hobby Lobby and other businesses have been in court for a long time in opposition to the Obama administration mandates that would require private businesses to spend money on abortion insurance and contraceptives that cause abortions in violation of their conscience. And he has said that he would like to restore that. In addition, he has committed to restoring funding for Planned Parenthood that the Trump administration has cut from Planned Parenthood to the extent that they were able to do so. So we see at every single level, and when we go back through Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, are we created in God's image? Are we unique because of that? Did he make us male and female? Did he create marriage to be a relationship between a man and a woman? And did he create us to be fruitful and multiply, or to prioritize the health of the planet as we kind of understand that? And did he create us to rule and subdue the earth, or are people actually the problem? It is not coincidental that as the culture has become more secular, the assaults on the plan, God's created plan in Genesis 1 and 2, have become much more specific. 60, 70 years ago, there was still a war between the culture and the gospel. Nothing has ever been perfect. But there was a general understanding. There was a less direct assault on God's revealed truth for the created order. Now that we have become more aggressively, more openly secularized, the assaults on the molecular level of the creation as God intended them have become much clearer. Now, one objection I want to address is this idea when it comes to the current election. I've heard the argument that, the Genesis, I agree with you, but the Genesis issues aren't really what's on the table. Social justice is what's on the table right now, and we're not talking about marriage, and really the president can't do anything about abortion, and we hear that argument a lot. What's the correct response to that? And again, I've made a similar point earlier, but I want to highlight this. This is the idea that, morally speaking, these foundational issues, for we as believers, if we want people to be able to make biblically consistent, biblically faithful, or just moral calculations that will actually achieve the common good, because God is the one who knows what the common good is, you have to be able to get the basics right. And if you want somebody to advance in a math class, you have to know first that 2 + 2 = 4. And morally speaking, what we're missing right now is people who do not understand that 2 + 2 = 4. So, if we want to advance them into calculus, we should not expect them to be successful if they cannot complete the idea, if they cannot successfully deduce and figure out that 2 + 2 = 4. Morally speaking, I think that's what we're dealing with, which is why there are other issues beyond what we see in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Social justice, in a sense, does matter. Race matters. Dignity of every person. Pro-life does not just mean pro-birth. All of those things are true. But it is naive for the church to believe that we can achieve God-honoring outcomes on those other issues when the people we task with solving those problems cannot solve even the most basic moral calculations about whether people should live or die. Now, is this their fault? I want to highlight the fact that why we can't trust them is because this is not simply a prudential difference of opinion. This is the fact that there are some people, because of the spiritual nature of their hearts, who simply don't have the capacity to do that, to reach the right conclusion. And we see this in Romans chapter 8, and I want to read this for you. Because the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not able to do so. And so Paul here in Romans is talking about a literal incapacity, an inability to reach the correct conclusion because their mind is set on the flesh. And a mind that is set on the flesh does not subject itself to the law of God. Now, occasionally, because of common grace, and we talked about that earlier, they can get the right conclusion, but if they do, it's an accident. So again, when we set up this contract, are they friends of the world or friends of the culture? These Genesis 1 issues are really where we find out if somebody is on God's side or if somebody is on the culture side. It's not the issues where we all agree. It's great that everybody wants to take care of the environment. It's great that everybody agrees we should take care of the less fortunate. It's great that everybody agrees that the marginalized need to be cared for and need to be brought in among us, and we need to take care of those who are less fortunate. Those are biblically good, true, and I'm glad we have agreement upon those things. But when it comes to selecting our leaders and finding out, can they achieve the common good as God sees them, you find out how they think and whether they're on God's side or not on God's side, not based on the areas of agreement that the culture has with the gospel, but the areas of disagreement. And what we see, I believe, with Joe Biden, and certainly not only Joe Biden, is we have a 100% voting record with the culture and against God when the culture and God disagree. So we as believers, can we give our affirmative to support to somebody that we can count on will disagree with God anytime the culture tells them not to? And I think the answer to that question is no. Now, very quickly, some resources for you as you vote. We have some great voting resources I want to direct you to for your own edification and education, because there's a lot more about these specific issues than I was able to get to today. But one resource I commend you to is a text voter guide capacity that we have. Wherever you are right now, if you get your phone out, text your zip code to 53445. Just text your zip code to 53445, and depending on where you are in the country, you'll have every race from the White House down to local judge races sent to you in about 3 seconds. The amount of time it would take you to get that information on your own would be probably weeks, and we'll give it to you in about 3 seconds if you text your zip code to 53445. In addition, if you want to find out more about the policy details of a Biden-Harris administration, if you want to see a comparison on the issues between a Biden-Harris administration and a Trump-Pence administration, go to PrayVoteStand.org. There are a number of resources there, including party platform comparisons, Trump versus Biden on the issues, where you can really, for yourself, dig down into those issues and find out everything that you need to make a good vote. And again, what's a good vote from a Christian perspective? We can have differences of opinion. People of goodwill can disagree. This isn't a matter of intelligence, and it's not a matter of intentions. But our job as Christians is God defines what's good for people. He understands best what leads to human flourishing. And our stewardship obligation is to lend our support to people who we think can move us toward the common good rather than further away from the common good. And if we find candidates on our ballot who will consistently, whenever the culture tells them that God is wrong, will agree that God is wrong, we should not empower them through our vote with the ability to lead and make decisions on our behalf. I hope this has been helpful to you. Of course, we'd love to have a conversation with you in the comments if that's where you're watching this. But reach out to us if you need more information. Pray Vote Stand, again, is where you can find a lot of great voting information. Hope you've enjoyed this time. Look forward to talking to you soon.